The Night Stalker, the hunt that changed Los Angeles forever. The summer of 1985 should have been like any other in Southern California. The days were warm, the nights were quiet, and millions of people went to sleep, believing the walls of their homes would keep them safe. But over the course of a few terrifying months, that sense of security disappeared. Every sunset brought a new wave of anxiety. Families checked their doors more than once before bed. Windows that had been left open to let in the cool evening air were now locked shut. Porch lights stayed on until morning, and neighborhood watch groups appeared almost overnight. No one knew where the next attack would happen. There was no obvious pattern. The attacker didn't seem to care whether a neighborhood was wealthy or working class, whether the victims were young or old, or whether they lived alone or with family. One night he would strike in one part of the city, and the next he could be miles away. The randomness created a level of fear unlike anything Southern California had experienced before. People couldn't avoid becoming a target because no one knew what made someone a target in the first place. As reports mounted, local police departments initially treated the incidents as separate investigations. Different cities handled different crime scenes, and detectives focused on solving the cases in their own jurisdictions. But as investigators began comparing notes, unsettling similarities started to emerge. Certain pieces of evidence suggested these weren't isolated crimes at all. They were connected. Slowly, a picture began to form. Somewhere in Southern California, one person was moving through neighborhoods under the cover of darkness, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. The media soon gave the unknown offender a name that would become infamous across the country: the Night Stalker. That nickname spread almost instantly. Newspapers splashed it across their front pages. Television anchors opened evening broadcasts with updates on the latest developments. Radio stations interrupted programming to report new information. What had started as a series of local investigations had become a regional crisis, and millions of people followed every new detail, hoping police were getting closer to an arrest. But behind the headlines were real families whose lives had been changed forever. For survivors, the emotional impact often lasted long after the physical injuries healed. Many spoke about losing the simple comfort of feeling safe inside their own homes. Places that had once represented peace and security suddenly became reminders of fear. Even neighbors who had never encountered the offender firsthand found themselves changing daily routines. Evening walks became less common. Parents insisted children come home before dark. Friends called one another before bed, just to make sure everyone was safe. Businesses noticed the change too. Hardware stores struggled to keep security products on their shelves. Deadbolts, reinforced locks, outdoor lighting, and alarm systems sold faster than suppliers could replace them. Locksmiths worked overtime, moving from house to house as worried homeowners searched for any extra layer of protection. Security companies reported unprecedented demand, and neighborhood meetings filled community centers with residents determined to protect one another. Law enforcement agencies faced a different kind of pressure. Every new attack meant more victims, more frightened communities, and more public scrutiny. Detectives worked around the clock, often sleeping only a few hours before returning to another crime scene. Crime lab technicians carefully collected fingerprints, shoe impressions, fibers, and every other piece of physical evidence they could find. Investigators knew that somewhere among those tiny details was the key to identifying the person responsible. Thousands of tips flooded police hotlines. Concerned residents reported suspicious vehicles parked on quiet streets. Others called after seeing unfamiliar people walking through neighborhoods late at night. Some tips came from people convinced they recognized the suspect from a newspaper sketch, while others were based on nothing more than a feeling that something wasn't right. Every lead had to be investigated. Most went nowhere. Still, detectives couldn't afford to dismiss any possibility. History had shown that even the smallest observation could become the breakthrough that solved an entire case. The investigation soon grew beyond the limits of individual police departments. Detectives from different jurisdictions began sharing evidence, comparing timelines, and coordinating strategies more closely than ever before. Information that might once have remained inside a single agency was now exchanged across county lines. It was a massive effort, involving investigators, forensic specialists, analysts, and prosecutors, all working toward the same goal: identifying the Night Stalker before another family was affected. At the center of that effort was forensic science. Unlike eyewitness testimony, physical evidence doesn't forget details or change over time. Crime scene investigators knew that every fingerprint, every footprint, and every trace left behind could eventually point them toward the offender. One particular fingerprint recovered during the investigation became especially important. Although investigators couldn't immediately identify who it belonged to, they understood its value. They preserved it carefully, knowing that if they ever found a suspect, that single piece of evidence could confirm what witnesses and theories never could. Meanwhile, behavioral analysts attempted to understand how the offender operated. He appeared comfortable moving through neighborhoods unnoticed. He often selected homes that seemed vulnerable or accessible, striking under the cover of darkness and leaving before police could respond. Yet despite examining patterns, investigators found it difficult to predict where he might appear next. His movements seemed deliberately unpredictable, forcing law enforcement to react rather than anticipate. That uncertainty was exhausting, not only for police, but for everyone living in Southern California. Every evening carried the same unanswered question: would tonight bring another attack? As the weeks passed, the pressure intensified. Political leaders demanded progress. Reporters pressed investigators for updates. Families wanted reassurance that the danger would soon be over. The detectives understood that solving a case like this required patience. Rushing to arrest the wrong person would only delay justice. They needed evidence strong enough to stand in court, not just satisfy public demand. Then, after months of relentless investigation, the case finally began to turn. A series of forensic discoveries and investigative leads started pointing detectives toward a specific individual. Information gathered from multiple crime scenes, combined with painstaking laboratory work, gave investigators something they had been missing since the beginning. For the first time, they weren't searching for an unknown figure hiding in the shadows. They had a suspect, and once they had a name, everything changed. For investigators, identifying a suspect was only the beginning. They still had to find him before he disappeared again. The task force worked quickly, reviewing every piece of information they had gathered over the previous months. Detectives retraced timelines, interviewed additional witnesses, and confirmed that the evidence from multiple crime scenes pointed to the same individual. What had once been a mystery with countless unanswered questions was finally becoming a focused manhunt. One piece of evidence proved especially significant. The fingerprint investigators had carefully preserved months earlier. This time, it could be compared to a known suspect. The match gave detectives confidence that they were on the right track. Combined with other evidence gathered throughout the investigation, it transformed months of uncertainty into a clear direction. Law enforcement now faced a new challenge. They knew who they were looking for, but they didn't know where he was. Time was critical. The longer the suspect remained at large, the greater the risk to the public. Detectives worked with local and federal agencies, sharing information as quickly as possible. Teams followed potential sightings, checked addresses connected to the investigation, and coordinated efforts across Southern California. Every hour mattered. Then investigators made a decision that would dramatically change the course of the case. They released the suspect's photograph to the public. Within hours, newspapers printed the image on their front pages. Television stations interrupted regular programming to show viewers exactly who authorities were searching for. Suddenly, millions of people weren't just hearing about the Night Stalker. They were looking directly at the face of the man police believed was responsible. The response was immediate. Across Southern California, people studied the photograph carefully. Shop owners taped newspaper clippings behind cash registers. Families discussed the news over breakfast and dinner. Co-workers pointed to the image during lunch breaks. Taxi drivers, bus operators, and store clerks all became part of an unofficial network of observers. It was one of the largest public searches the region had ever seen. Then, only days after the photograph became widely available, the investigation reached its dramatic conclusion. According to contemporary reports, several residents recognized the suspect while he was walking through a neighborhood. They immediately contacted authorities, and word spread rapidly among nearby residents. Before police could arrive, members of the public confronted him and prevented him from leaving the area. When officers reached the scene, they took Richard Ramirez into custody, without the lengthy chase many had expected. For detectives who had spent months pursuing leads, collecting evidence, and working countless hours, the arrest marked the end of one of California's most demanding investigations. But for survivors and victims' families, another difficult chapter was about to begin. The criminal justice process moved forward with intense public attention. Courtrooms filled with journalists, legal experts, and members of the public eager to understand how investigators had built their case. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence collected from multiple crime scenes, along with testimony from witnesses and survivors. The investigation that had unfolded across countless neighborhoods was now being examined piece by piece before a jury. The trial lasted for years, reflecting both the complexity of the case and the amount of evidence involved. Throughout the proceedings, investigators described the painstaking work required to connect separate incidents, preserve evidence, and coordinate between different law enforcement agencies. The case demonstrated just how important careful forensic work had become in modern criminal investigations. Eventually, the jury returned its verdict. Richard Ramirez was found guilty on numerous charges and sentenced according to California law. For many families, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but it could never erase the losses they had experienced or the years of fear that had affected entire communities. Survivors continued rebuilding their lives, while loved ones remembered those who were taken from them. Their resilience became an important part of the story, even if it received far less attention than the investigation itself. Looking back, the Night Stalker case changed more than one criminal investigation. It influenced the way police agencies cooperated across jurisdictions, reinforcing the value of sharing intelligence instead of working in isolation. It highlighted the growing importance of forensic science, showing that fingerprints and other physical evidence could connect crimes that at first seemed unrelated. It also demonstrated the role an informed public can play when accurate information is shared responsibly. The case remains widely studied by investigators, criminologists, and historians, not because of the notoriety of the offender, but because it illustrates how determined police work, forensic science, and community awareness can come together to solve an extraordinarily difficult investigation. It's easy for infamous cases to become defined by the person who committed the crimes. Headlines often focus on the name that generated public attention, but that approach can overshadow the people whose lives were forever changed. The true story of the Night Stalker isn't simply about a man who evaded capture for months. It's about the detectives who refused to stop searching despite constant setbacks. It's about forensic specialists who understood that a single fingerprint might one day unlock the entire investigation. It's about neighbors who looked out for one another during a period of intense fear. And above all, it's about the survivors and the victims' families, whose courage and resilience endured long after the headlines faded. Even decades later, the lessons from this case continue to influence law enforcement training and investigative practices. Modern technology has advanced dramatically since 1985, but the principles that helped solve the Night Stalker investigation remain the same. Preserve the evidence, follow the facts, work together, and never lose sight of the people seeking justice. As one of the most significant criminal investigations in American history, the Night Stalker case serves as a reminder that fear can spread quickly, but so can determination. When investigators, forensic experts, and ordinary citizens work toward the same goal, even the most complex mysteries can eventually be solved. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime stories that focus on the investigations, the evidence, and the pursuit of justice. If there's another historic case you'd like us to explore, let us know in the comments. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.